Hey everyone. In this video, I want to talk about The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. The novel is pictured here with my dog, Doug, who also clearly likes it almost as much as I do. Um, First, I want to remind you that this novel is part of the contemporary literary period, so if you haven't yet watched the video on contemporary literature that I've posted for you this week, please pause and watch that video first. All right, so let's talk about the novel. It was published 5 years ago, but set before the Civil War, beginning with the slave trade. So when in the very first chapter of the novel, Ajari, we're going to start way back at the beginning of the slave trade with Cora's grandmother. Cora is our protagonist. This novel was a huge critical success. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It won the National Book Critics Circle, or excuse me, the National Book Critics Award, the two most prestigious literary awards in America, I would say. But it also was popular with readers, winning the Goodreads Choice Award for Best Historical Fiction. Before we move to the next slide, I want to warn you that the image is based on stereotypes and really offensive by our time. I want to talk briefly about the kinds of stereotypes that people had in this country about slavery. Um, this is a postcard, and this kind of imagery was quite popular during the slavery period and well into the 20th century as well. This idea of the happy slave, this pro-slavery propaganda, was really pervasive throughout the United States, not just in the slaveholding South during the slavery period. Um, Here's a popular image by the artists Currier and Ives that is called The Old Plantation Home. And you can see in the background the big house, the plantation home, and in the foreground you can see what is supposedly a cabin for an enslaved family. And boy, does it look very charming and domestic and idealized. Books like The Underground Railroad and a lot of fiction and history that addresses slavery is going to paint a very different picture, obviously. The next image is very difficult to see, so you might want to close your eyes for a minute. It's an image of an enslaved person that tells us the truth about slavery. You may have seen this before. This man's name was Gordon, and you can see the scars of slavery on his back. So it's just important to note how violent the institution of slavery was and how Whitehead is addressing that history in this novel. Okay, the image is gone. Let's talk about the literary influences that Whitehead is working with. First of all, slave narratives. There's a separate video that I've posted for you if you want to read a little bit more. It's a video that I make when I teach African American literature about the whole genre of slave narratives, specifically the type of slave narratives that were written by the men and women themselves who had escaped slavery. They did their own writing, as opposed to the kind that were narrated to a white anthropologist who wrote them down. Okay, so in these slave narratives, especially by Frederick Douglass or Harriet Jacobs, you may have encountered those previously in your education. There's a basic plot pattern that they tend to all follow. First of all, the writer explains their loss of innocence and the moment they became aware of the fact that they were enslaved. And this stage really details the trauma of slavery, the dehumanization of slavery, and not just the physical anguish, but also the intellectual, emotional, and spiritual anguish and deprivation. This is according to the Norton Anthology of African American Literature. In this stage, the writer would describe an increasing self-reliance, sense of independence, and often that involved learning to read and write. The second major stage in these plots tends to be the resolution to be free. I can't take any more of this. I'm going to escape. And sometimes it takes quite a while between the moment that they make that decision and the moment that they are actually able to escape. So in that escape, there's the struggle to overcome evil in the quest for freedom. And then finally, at the end of these slave narratives, there's redemption. Freedom is obtained. Writers like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs also describe how they become committed to the abolitionist movement, committed to their fellow sisters and brothers in slavery. So keep this in mind as you read the novel. This is not a slave narrative. Slave narrative was autobiography, it was nonfiction. But pay attention to how Whitehead is using some of these ideas, some of these patterns from these historical documents in his novel. And then also some of the themes and motifs in slave narratives we see here. The abuses of slavery, physical abuses, sexual abuses, starvation, the loss of family members when families are split up and sold away, when they're killed, the piety or faith of people who are enslaved, enslavers' hypocrisy and their own corruption. Again, the enslaved person's quest for literacy, the importance of literacy in that journey and the quest for freedom. So again, think about how Whitehead is using these themes that we've seen before in anti-slavery works and fictionalizing them. Okay, another big device that he uses, you may have noticed if you've skimmed through the book, is the use of fugitive slave ads. Now, these were real advertisements that slaveholders would post in newspapers, and they would create flyers and hang them around the town after somebody ran away. This is the actual ad placed for Harriet Jacobs. I mentioned her earlier. So you can see there's a physical description of her, a description of her personality, a description of how she ran away or when, and then the offering of the reward. Whitehead talked about how he used these runaway slave ads as inspiration. I'm just going to read this quotation that he gave in an interview on NPR. And I like being a mimic when I'm writing, but then sometimes you can't compete with the actual historical document. And so the University of North Carolina digitized these runaway slave classifieds from newspapers at the early part of the 19th century. And there were 5 of them. The first 4 are mostly verbatim from newspapers, and then the 5th one is Cora's, and that's one I created for her, hopefully being true to her story. So again, notice how Whitehead uses these actual advertisements for the capture of these human beings in his novel. Okay, so again, I asked you to watch the contemporary literature video. Notice how Whitehead, like other contemporary writers, is really experimenting with form by using these unusual storytelling devices like these ads. Notice how he will use alinear plots. So there's the use of flash forward and flash back. So sometimes the timeline can be a little tricky to follow. Pay attention to that. Also pay attention to how he's taking liberties with the historical timeline. Notice where he's referring to very specific historical events that may have happened before or after the actual period in which he's writing. Let's take a look at this first sentence. The first time Caesar approached Cora about running north, she said no. So this first sentence tells us some stuff, right? It tells us that there's a man named Caesar, a woman named Cora. Caesar asks Cora about escaping multiple times, and she says no. We don't have any backstory. We just kind of start right in the middle. And again, he will be moving back and forth in chronological time to tell this story about Cora. So be patient with that. And if you get confused, make sure you ask, okay? So the other thing I want to talk about is how these writers experimented with subject matter. I already mentioned that he takes liberties with the historical record and historical timeline with certain events that occur in this book. I also want you to know about something called magical realism. Make sure you understand this term. Magical realism is when magical or supernatural events occur in an otherwise realistic context. So, Harry Potter is not an example of magical realism because the whole world of Harry Potter is magical, right? Is fantasy. Magical realism occurs when the rest of the novel is realistic, but then you have just these moments of magic or supernatural things that are unrealistic. I want you to think about how Whitehead depicts the Underground Railroad. He talks about this in the video one of the videos I posted, one of the interviews. We know from studying basic U.S. history that the Underground Railroad is not literally underground, right? Underground means secret. It doesn't mean literally a subway. Subways, they didn't exist. There wasn't the technology for them. So notice how Whitehead takes this concept of the Underground Railroad and makes it literal but also magical. Um, he said, I love this quotation, I'm not going to stick to the facts, but I'll stick to the truth. So again, he may be taking liberties with the historical record in order to get to the larger truth of slavery. Oops, there we go. So, my advice to you for reading this novel is to pace yourself. Try to read it in smaller sections. Some of the subject matter, because it's about slavery and white supremacy, is emotionally taxing to read. It just really is. I think it's important to read it and confront it. But I would suggest that you pace yourself and don't try to read it all at once. As always, I'd like you to use the reading guide. There's some more info in the reading guide that I haven't provided here. Ask questions. There's a thread in discussions where you can do that, and we'll also have our regular optional virtual sessions. But try to be okay with a little uncertainty. Sometimes you're just not supposed to know what's happening yet, and trust that Whitehead will reveal it to you. And then just savor the power of Whitehead's writing. Whitehead is considered to be one of the greatest American writers now living. He is now living. He's about my age. He's got another book coming out really soon, within a matter of weeks, I think. So it's really great to have this opportunity to read the work of such an outstanding, well-regarded living American writer, African American writer as well. I think that's all I had to say for you. So again, if you have any questions, make sure that you let me know. I'm happy to help you with this novel. I have made a couple changes in the reading schedule, so take a look at that and enjoy the novel.